Heckman, speaking on the myth of achievement tests, the GED, and the role of character in American life. Edited by James J. Heckman, John Eric Humphries, and Tim Kautz from the University of Chicago Press, 2014. James J. Heckman is a Nobel Prize-winning economist and the Henry Schultz Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Chicago. He's the director of the Economics Research Center at the University of Chicago and co-director of the Human Capital and Economic Opportunity Global Working Group, an initiative of the Institute for New Economic Thinking and the Becker-Friedman Institute. He's the author of several books, including most recently, Giving Kids a Fair Chance. Let's welcome him. Thank you.
That's slightly inaccurate. That's slightly inaccurate because this is the latest book, I guess. But nonetheless. Okay, well, thank you all for coming, and I certainly want to introduce my co-authors. So, John Eric Humphries, I want you to stand up, and Tim Kautz. And I hope they'll talk as well. This is a collective effort. The book is basically viewed, I guess it would be sold or interpreted as an edited book. But a lot of the essays in the book are actually written by us, the editors. I would guess by 60–70% of the whole book. And let me give you a little bit of background, and then you guys can talk as well, right? So, because these guys are really our co-authors. This is not just a courtesy assignment to an RA or something. These guys, this was a very important project, and it took a long time to put it together. But let me just give the background. Some years ago, I got interested in the question of understanding what is a very important phenomenon in American education, and that's the GED. When I started looking at this, about 18% of all high school credentials, I don't know if everybody knows what the GED is, but it's basically an exam that high school dropouts can take to certify that they are the equivalents of ordinary high school graduates. And so we were getting 18% of all credentials issued in the United States due to GEDs. So I got interested in this many years ago, and I was actually visiting a job training center in Corpus Christi, Texas. And the people at the job training center pointed out that there was a miracle going on. This was in San Antonio, Texas. No, it was actually in Corpus Christi, near San Antonio. But we actually, so the miracle was that in about 6 to 8 weeks of instruction, people in a GED class who were ordinarily at the grade level of 6th grade in terms of their high school education, many of these were Hispanics living in the so-called valley area, right between the Rio Grande Valley, between Texas and Mexico. Many of these people were really at 6th grade, maybe 8th grade level. And just in a few weeks, maybe 2 months of training, they were getting at the level of high school graduates. It seemed like a great thing. If you can take this test and do it, you can save a lot of money. Everybody can take the test. And of course, it turns out historically, Robert Hutchins, who was here at the university in the 30s, thought that it would be very useful to test people and see whether or not they needed to take any further education. If they really had a high level of education, or high level of understanding, they didn't need to take any further education. And he wanted them actually to exam certify and come to the University of Chicago at about age 15. So the University of Chicago plays a very important role in this book, as I'll say in a minute. But what we looked at, or what a group of us initially, not this group initially, looked at was how the GEDs fared in American society in the workplace and in other levels of like hours of work, occupational choice, participation in crime. How these people compared to high school dropouts and to high school graduates of an ordinary sort. And what we found was pretty striking. This was a very crude study. The children were very young. They were only in their early 20s, I think, relative to the data that we actually analyze in this book. What we found is that the GEDs were not doing very well. And once you control for their greater cognitive ability, and they did have cognitive ability, there was higher cognitive ability. Not a much more, but there was greater than ordinary high school dropouts would have, that they actually were earning the wages of high school dropouts. And so that was just an interesting fact about the GED. But then it led to the question of what's going on with the GED. And this kind of led to a long trail, which this book is at least a stopping road on the way to understanding it, a way station anyway. And what we found, and through a series of papers which are summarized in this book, and a series of papers by other people as well, that the GED participants, the ones who exam certify, lack what are sometimes called soft skills or non-cognitive skills, perseverance, the ability to stay on tasks, and that those tasks are heavily rewarded in the workplace, in educational facilities, in shaping crime, and in creating a tremendous number of dimensions of participation and success in social life. So the book is actually organized around several different points. First of all, we talk about the evolution of the GED. And this takes us to a broader question. The GED is an example of the achievement test, which is widely used. I mean, almost everybody in this room took an achievement test at some point, like the Iowa test of basic achievement. Many people would say the SAT is a form of an achievement test. And we know that all of the American education system is heavily focused around now in terms of evaluating schools in terms of these achievement tests. And the question was whether or not the achievement test was actually successfully, of which the GED is an example, was successfully creating the right kind of evaluation of school outcomes. So you asked the following question. I ask this question all the time, but what percentage of the variability in wages across people do you think is explained by IQ? IQ, not achievement test. Anybody have any rough idea? Just being really smart explains how much variability across people in wages. Anybody want to hazard a guess?
5%.
What?
5%.
Yeah, he's an ex-student, all right. But many people would say 50% or 25%. And the achievement test score is actually a little bit higher. And so why is that? Well, in terms of predictions, 7, 8, 9%, it's nowhere near. Yeah, okay, you'll get these guys to check the facts here to make sure. So what's going on? And why does the achievement test predict more? And what are the dimensions that we're missing in all of this kind of testing movement? And what we found was that when we start measuring cognitive and non-cognitive traits, and we start measuring how these things evolve, we find that they're very important. They explain a lot of the variability. Achievement tests capture not only how smart you are, just in a raw IQ sense, but how much you've learned. And learning is partly motivated by, just how passionate people are, the kind of, so you acquire more knowledge if you're more self-controlled, you can stay on task, and so forth. So there's no accident here that, in fact, achievement tests are somewhat more predictive. And grades are actually very highly predictive, especially of success in college. More predictive, actually, than the achievement test scores. And people say, well, why is that? Well, what do grades capture? The whole idea, one of the ideas about the achievement test when it was originally created, was that the achievement test would avoid the bias that's inherent in grades. The idea is that high school grades, teachers have a lot of bias. The bias would actually distort the statistics, and kids might fall the victim of a teacher who had it out for them, or out for a whole group of people. The idea was some measure of objectivity. But ironically, the grades captured, because they capture this kind of intensity, they capture more than just how smart you are, how hard you've worked, how much you persevered. And we found that these factors play a huge role, and they play into our understanding of the GED and and why the GEDs aren't doing very well, and why other measures of ability, cognitive and non-cognitive, that are currently used in the American educational system can be far more effective. So we consider this. You guys want to add something? Please feel free. No, go ahead. No, don't be shy. It's a small group, so you shouldn't. But the idea is really very simple then, when you think about it as a test. But the fact of the matter is that we have been very uncritical in our use of these tests, what these tests measure. And we don't want to pretend in this book that we've settled the whole issue. And the reason is we know that in terms of non-cognitive measures, in terms even of ability measures, there's a whole range of measures that are still being tried out. It's still a field very much in evolution. Tim is doing some work in the city of Chicago looking at teachers' ratings through schools. These are City of Chicago schools, seeing how well the ratings by teachers early on in the school career can predict later life performance in graduating high school and going on to college. So that's an aspect of this. So it's really giving us a deeper understanding what achievement tests measure. That's kind of one contribution. But then secondly, we ask the question, well, we have this fixation in American society on test scores. And what does it cost us to do this? So if the GED is actually kind of a very imperfect measure, and GEDs are really like high school dropouts, then how does this affect the way we think about social statistics? Now, a very interesting phenomenon was until very recently, and in fact still in some data sets, right, so like the census data sets still, I think, are still not making a distinction. The GEDs are treated the same as high school graduates. They're basically treated the same. And this led to some serious distortions. For example, there was a big finding that many people touted that between 1960 and the year 2000, 2010, that there was substantial convergence in the high school graduation rates of African Americans and whites in American society. But it turned out that the GED was largely responsible. The fact that the GED was counted as a high school graduate, once you got rid of the GEDs from the ordinary statistics on who is a dropout, we actually found that the dropout rate for African Americans is really no different in 1960 than it was in the year 2005. And so we were deluding ourselves just by using this test and not really understanding that the high school equivalents were not. So that was one dimension. But then we went further, and again, these guys really should talk. They played a huge role in taking this analysis further. The question is, so these non-cognitive traits are important. If we don't look at these non-cognitive, and by the way, on this question about high school dropout rate, it turned out that a fair number of the African American GEDs were acquired in prison. So as a result of this boost of this big boom in incarceration rates among African Americans, there was a tremendous distortion in social statistics. So because we were sending more people to prison, and because many prisons had the requirement that everybody take the GED or something like it to get out of, or to lighten their term and to get easier parole terms and so forth, faster parole terms, that we actually substantially distorted statistics. The crime, the incarceration boom helped lead to the reduction in the high school deficit, but totally bogus. Okay, so that's one aspect. But then American social policy has really focused very heavily on the structure of the test. So we ask, well, what happens when you change incentives in public schools? You have this test, which is fairly easy to take. It doesn't. So suppose you're in New York State, where you have the state regents, or some exam, a very high stakes exam, which has become more common among many states in the country. What we find is that precisely as high stakes testing is introduced, more students are turning to take the GED. It's the easy way out. They don't have to study as hard, and they can actually get high school qualifications. So that's very distortionary. And we have, you maybe want to talk about the study in Oregon or the studies in California. Go ahead, speak.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, I think you could talk about it, but
I'm sure I could, but go ahead.
I mean, there's a lot of evidence that, or for example, there's this GED option program in Oregon where they introduce the GED program into public high schools, and in the public high schools, they target students that are at risk, which usually means a year behind in credits. And they offer them GED preparation courses instead of traditional high school classes. And then usually in 6 months to a year, they can then earn their GED and exit high school. And when you introduce this, I guess, middle option between dropping out and graduating, especially when it's in the high school, we see that in Oregon, the districts that implement these programs see about a 4% fall relative to districts that don't in high school graduation rates. And similarly, there's other completer rates go up by about 3%, which is how these GEDs are being counted in the Oregon statistics.
Yeah. So programs that are initially well-intentioned making the mistake, I think. It's a mistake of just equating the score on an achievement test with really true knowledge and true ability to perform in the workplace. We're really distorting social policies, and we're actually causing kids to drop out of high school effectively. And so I think that's another dimension that's extremely important. So let me step back a second, though, and ask, how did we get to the GED? And the reason why I want to step back for a second is that it's really a University of Chicago story. We're here on campus, and we might talk about it. There was a very famous psychometrician, a psychologist, an educational psychologist named Ralph Tyler. Tyler was actually dean of the social sciences here. He, along with a guy named Lindquist at the University of Iowa, developed the achievement test. And again, the hope in the original study was to try to be able to measure schools that had very different curricula, to try to make some comparability across schools. Now, the GED itself, though, got constructed in the Second World War. And it was done as a means of trying to determine whether or not people who had been drafted out of high school, I mean, this was really a time of great emergency when many people, many young men were taken out of civilian life. They didn't finish high school, and they were sent into the Army. But they did get courses in the Army. There was an Armed Forces testing and educational institute which gave courses. And then, of course, they matured, so they picked up a whole series of life experiences. And so the idea was, well, let's think about a way of bringing veterans. Initially, these are wounded veterans, and then it became expanded to all veterans as the program, as the war progressed, to see whether or not their service in the Army or the service in the armed services and their experiences had really put them at the level where they could now go on to college or do something that would require a high school credential. So that was initially a well-intentioned program targeted only towards veterans. But then gradually it spread out. I think by 1947 or 1948, states like New York and a lot of East Coast states, I think California was one of the last states to adopt the GED in the 70s. But again, the notion was we have this dropout problem. If we can solve the dropout problem by giving people the GED, then this is great social policy. And of course, that was the belief then that the test, the cognitive test, was a very good measure of how people would succeed or fail in the rest of life. So there was a very strong faith that's actually become, if anything, stronger in the last 20 years or so, as we've gotten to high-stakes testing, No Child Left Behind, and various ways to evaluate PISA scores across countries and so on. So this started as a well-intentioned device, but gradually, the people taking the GED were no longer highly motivated veterans who had, taken Army service. They had to go through basic training. They survived a lot of tests. They were highly motivated and had a lot of these skills that we call non-cognitive or social and emotional skills. And then it spread to a more general group of dropouts, many of whom wouldn't be accepted in the Army. They simply are not able, and they're not highly motivated. So that was one reason why the test that was probably fairly effective early on became diluted in its base. But it was partly also, I think, just the thinking. This is by academics here at the university and others who followed, thinking that we could somehow capture important dimensions of human behavior with a single test score or a series of short number of test scores. Many of you look like students or former students, so you've all been subject to these tests and have taken them. And you know that there is a kind of tyranny that's associated with these tests. So we're partly, I wouldn't say exploding the myth, but we're questioning the myth. But all along the way, since the beginning of the GED, since the first achievement test, all of its creators, Ralph Tyler, Lindquist, and the successors, all said the same thing. We're capturing only a small part of what's really important for learning. And we're capturing it in a way that may be very distorting. And other methods were suggested. Methods of looking at teacher ratings, some of the same methods we're using in this book, Tim's using in his work on the Chicago schools. So Tyler suggested this. Even the National Association, the National Assessment for Educational Progress, when Tyler designed that, he said, we're only measuring a small amount with the cognitive skills, and suggested much broader inventories. But that takes us to the second point. Many people say, well, soft skills, that already suggests that we don't have very good measures. And part of this book is developing these measures and trying to see exactly how we can look at behaviors, measures, look at the psychometrics and the psychology, to look at what measures, what kinds of aspects of human performance early in life are predictive, significant traits that matter. And so that's part of what the book is doing. But now there's an issue that I think many people would take exception to and say, well, somehow there's a kind of fatalism. And when you discuss traits, whether they're cognitive or non-cognitive, you did this like 50 years ago, everybody thought these things were genetically determined, that somehow that these were characteristics of race groups or peoples and so forth. And what's happened in the last 50 years, and as the achievement test scores have gone on and the psychology has gotten much deeper, as we've come to understand much more the psychology and the foundations of the psychology, we've come to understand that what we used to think of as traits are really skills. So instead of thinking these as somehow genetically given, that are determined at birth and fixed for all life, we actually understand they can be acquired. And we study in chapter 9 of the book a whole series of interventions. We look at various measurement questions from a technical perspective, but we also look at interventions over the whole life cycle, at least into the early 20s, finding where and when these interventions are effective in promoting these soft skills. And we find that even early childhood interventions that occur in adolescence and so forth, can really be quite effective in promoting soft skills. And this in part is due to the fact that what we think of as emotional regulation and so forth, where the neurosciences would talk about the developing prefrontal cortex, where they're thinking about what governs our emotions, what really gives us this drive. These are developing. And because they're developing, they can also be subject to intervention. And we actually document that there are a number of successful interventions. So the study is not one of fatalism. It's not saying kids are born dumb or they're born disobedient. It suggests how education and by a series of other interventions we can promote these life skills that will actually give people success and open up success in life. So I guess that's the main contours. Have I missed anything? I mean, we could talk about Horace Mann and the original. I mean, what we're really saying is taking us back to educational policy, the way that was developed in the 1840s. If you look at Horace Mann and you look at the common school movement, Mann was writing, I think you have a quote, something to the effect that reading and writing and arithmetic are but the smallest part of what we teach in school. That was the essence of what he was saying. And so the idea of character education was really central to Mann and to, I think, to the whole notion of the common school movement. And we document in the first chapter of the book how this emphasis gradually got weeded out from American education. And it got weeded out for several reasons. The first installment of this, the first version of this, was heavily related to what many people would thought of as kind of Protestant, Christian, moral values. So character education was generally associated with religious education. And because of that, as America became more diverse, the idea of teaching Protestant Christian values to ethnically diverse Catholic schools were very resistant to having Protestant Christian values taught. They had their own school system and their own values, their own ways of teaching these values. And so as the schools became increasingly secular, and as, again, a series of court cases came separating church and state, and as cognitive psychology got developed, and so it became, in the 60s, the notion that cognition was really the be-all and end-all, and that these traits that were soft and fuzzy really couldn't be measured anyway, or were very subject to bias. But gradually we became to focus on these tests, which again, to repeat, are really not capturing all that's really important in life. So I think we're kind of going back in some sense, not suggesting religious education of secular Protestant or evangelical religious training, because we actually have a series of interventions. Across all cultural and religious groups, there are these same, I think, basic values on, trying to keep people self-controlled. There are very few cultures that are teaching people to be violent, not self-controlled, and stupid, saying be all the above. People have common aspirations. And what's interesting now is we've developed our understanding of these methods, or how we can actually produce these skills to create greater opportunities for people. I think what we've come to understand that the tight link that was there in religion, it's not to say that religious instruction doesn't have an important role. In fact, there are many studies suggesting that religious instruction properly structured actually can play a very important role. But it's not necessarily that it be in a religious format, and that it can be conducted. And so one of the common features, and here I'll stop because I guess we're supposed to take 15 minutes and we're now already a little bit past that. So I think the structure that's really important maybe to understand is that we have a deeper understanding of the traits of the kind of environments that promote both cognitive and social and emotional traits. What we understand now, it's really more of a theory of education and something that we're starting to understand more deeply. And that is, we think about education, or the typical way of thinking about education is as kind of a professor like me standing in front of you and giving you a lecture. But when we think about how real education, these character traits are developed, it's interaction of the parent with the child, the teacher with the child. That's what successful education is all about. And so Dewey has this famous quote, which we actually cite in the book, that a successful school does what a successful parent does. And that's interaction, guidance, mentoring. But we also find the same ingredients when you look at the adolescent interventions that are successful. We're actually looking at those adolescent interventions. The mentoring programs that provide relationships between the teacher and or the mentor and the adolescent mentee exactly have the same trait. I mean, they're age adjusted. It's a very different kind of relationship than with a 3-year-old child. But you're finding that this nature of interaction, that's the nature of learning. And that then takes us right back to Horace Mann when you were, the McGuffey's Reader, which was a little bit after Horace Mann, I guess, teaching people these aspects of character and so forth. So I guess one of the things, and one of the aspects of the book that many people found controversial is the word character, because that sounds very Victorian, it sounds very prudish. But character is now becoming widely used, much more widely used. And it's a whole group now at Brookings. Richard Reeves is using this. And it's really not to understand some kind of prudish value or a particular set of behaviors or a particular set of beliefs, so much as a particular set of capacities, the ability to be able to function successfully in a variety of different situations. That's what we mean by character, and sort of giving people the possibility of fulfilling their lives rather than, shaping them in any particular way, because there are a lot of different sizes and shapes out there, and there are a lot of different value systems out there about how you should live your life and what you should value in your life. But almost all of them ask that there be some basic characteristics, and those are the traits we call character traits, or skills, I guess I should say. So do you guys want to add something, or? There's plenty to add.
It, yeah.
What? You've heard this too many times? But no, go ahead.
No, I thought that was a very good summary. I guess the only thing I would add is that, elaborate on the last point, which is that the introduction of these character skills, or the reintroduction perhaps, is really exciting from an educational policy point of view, because they can actually be shaped at later ages than cognitive skills. So we find little evidence that interventions after very young ages, we're talking like 5 or 6, have an effect on cognitive ability. Yet a lot of them at that age still help. They have huge effects on other life outcomes that we care about, like crime, on education, on earnings. And they do that by improving the non-cognitive skills. So it really leaves us on an optimistic note that there's something you can do, and that it also has some lessons about how you evaluate these kinds of programs, and that you want to really look at a broader notion of what a program could do for someone.
We were just talking with somebody from doing a study in Montreal, a very interesting study, exactly on this point. There was an intervention designed. I didn't even know about this intervention until last night, but the speaker was here at Chicago today. This was an intervention on kids these were boys, who were primarily at risk for disorder and violence and so forth. This is done originally by Richard Tremblay, as a psychologist in Montreal. But they gave an explicit focus on developing these non-cognitive soft skills. They randomly assigned people to treatment and control at ages 7 to 9. They followed these people into their 40s. And what's amazingly interesting is that they're finding tremendous benefits in terms of reduction in crime, in terms of violence, but also in terms of wages, educational attainment, and the like. And it suggests a real avenue of opportunity. And it's not just an early childhood intervention. We're talking about 7 to 9, when actually the problems might be even more easily identified among young children. So again, it's to be determined, and I've just learned about it. But there's a burgeoning activity, I think, which this book contributes to, about really understanding these kind of missing dimensions of the educational policy, thinking about these character traits and thinking of it as being something really serious, not just a frivolous thought. I will add with one final note that there was a part of the reason why non-cognitive skills and social emotional skills got kicked out of the whole discussion was a paper, or book, I guess, by a famous psychologist named Walter Mischel, who's still alive. He's in his 80s, working at Columbia University. And Mischel basically made the claim that the only predictive traits were cognitive traits, and that these measures of personality that the psychologists had developed had no stable trait. Its personality was not a stable characteristic, and it isn't anything we should measure or worry about. And there was no way we think about shaping policy, because everything was situationally determined. You are what you need to be in that situation. And there's been a pushback of that in personality psychology. It's true, situations matter, but it's not the whole story. And the great irony is Mischel is this psychologist who's also probably, you all know probably better, as the one who developed the marshmallow test. You've all heard about the marshmallow test?
No.
Oh, well, the marshmallow test, they gave these kids who were like 3 or 4 years of age at some Stanford preschool the choice, saying, well, we'll give you one marshmallow now, but if you wait for 20 minutes, we'll give you a second marshmallow. Well, so Mischel, the same guy who said there are no stable personality traits, ends up showing that at age 20 years later, the kids who waited for the second marshmallow were the ones who were much more likely to complete schooling, much more likely to go to school, much less crime, and so forth. And by the way, Walter Mischel, in his latest work, has really, I wouldn't say reneged, but he certainly admitted that there are some stable aspects to personality. But that was just part of the intellectual confluence, right? You had a time
The
when...
issue was delayed gratification.
Delayed gratification, exactly. But I would call that a non-cognitive trait, right? And that's kind of one of many. I mean, it's not a single trait. There's a whole bundle of traits, and we're still sorting them out. So, the Big Five is one inventory, but in the book we discuss the Big Five and a number of other inventories, and that's very much something in progress. So economists are now working with psychologists using methods to elicit preferences by games, these games that are partly of experimental economics and so forth, linking those, though, to the psychological measurements. And so it's really understanding exactly how we can refine our understanding of these traits or these skills. So it's an area. I hope this is the first installment. Certainly by these guys, the first installment. And I think it's an exciting area, and it does lead to a broader view of what's possible in educational policy. So, are there questions? Or yeah, please.
Is the GED still owned by the American Council on Education?
No.
No.
It was bought by Pearson.
Recently,
owns it.
right.
Well, then I have a statement and then a real question.
Okay, please. You helped develop the...
Well, for 12 and a half years I was president of the College Board.
Right.
Which owns the SAT and advanced placement. And I tried to buy the GED from the American Council on Education so that the College Board would administer not only with ETS, not only the SAT, but the GED. And many members of my board were not happy with this. And I'm anxious to read the book, largely because of the population taking the GED. These were not the clean, middle-class kids who go to good colleges. I mean, that was another issue. Just one other piece of information.
And there's evidence on that. We actually find that the GEDs are typically coming from more disadvantaged environments.
Right.
And some of these gaps are opening up quite early. And
that's why it may be a better intervention instrument in a diverse society. And
what, the GED?
The GED. I mean, if it's properly used, and
I
don't know. I'm going to read your book. And
well, no, we actually. So, by the way, when we say that the GED is not effective, there's one important exception we should probably talk about, right? And that is teenage girls who are pregnant. Girls who are pregnant. many of them will drop out of school. And educational policies in some parts of the United States will force them out of school, right? If you're pregnant. I mean, not in a lot of big city schools, but in some of the smaller schools in some states, you can't be pregnant. And so what would happen is their education's delayed. Now, many of these girls who get pregnant are actually pretty smart. And they're actually pretty motivated by all the other life measures that we have. We have panel data, so we can follow these people over their whole life cycle. I forgot to mention that. That's the important part of it. It's not just one data set, it's 6 different data sets. So we find that it's a lifeline for these girls. What happens is, once their kids get to be of age, they can put them in child care, say at 3 and 4, safely, put them in child care. Many of them will go back, take the GED, or have taken the GED while they're, out of school, essentially, and then will go on and maybe get an associate's degree. But what we also find is they never quite succeed. There's another whole dimension. Their earnings are about the same as those of high school graduates, right? Who don't go on to college. These GED women, right?
Yeah, their wages are the same. They're more likely to work.
They're more likely to work. That's the point. They're very hardworking. They're highly motivated. So it does offer a lifeline for them. So I don't want to just say, the GED's a curse. But I think when you get to the point where you start issuing prison GEDs and you're starting to motivate kids to drop out of school, then it becomes kind of a negative policy. And there I think you really want to qualify. Yes?
I want to probe a little bit this period of time that you've touched on.
Yes.
Between the moment that students drop out up to the point that they take the GED.
Right.
And then think a little bit about the context of how your work gets interpreted on in the world now that it's been coming out, and then with this book.
Okay.
So I work in this field, and about half of
How are you involved?
I train instructors.
GED instructors?
I do research, yeah, in
Okay.
teaching math to adult students who have dropped out of school.
Okay.
Here in the city.
Good. And?
And about half of the students who take it past the GED, you guys might correct my numbers, but about half don't do any instruction formal instruction in any kind of a preparation program before they go and take it. So they just
Very
they
limited.
may decide just like, well, I'm going to go take my shot at it, or maybe they get a book off of one of these shelves in a bookstore and they do a little bit of prep and they go and take it and they pass it. So about half the passers do no instruction beyond their K-12 experience before they dropped out. And the other half enter some sort of a preparation program, perhaps like the one you saw in Corpus Christi.
Right. And some take 2-year degrees. They're like adult high schools, really, right?
Some, but the majority go to programs that are funded through the federal government.
Right.
And the money spent in that system, if you can call it one, invests about $900 per student per year, which is less than a tenth what's spent in the K-12 system
Correct.
per student per year.
Right.
So it's like a starving system in terms of resources. So the teachers who are largely employed across the country doing preparation for students who've dropped out and are trying to pass this test themselves are part-time, without benefits, poorly educated themselves.
Right.
In many cases can barely pass the GED themselves, and they are the ones doing the instruction. So
Right.
a lot of these
By
students
instruction,
are...
you mean coaching.
Most of us in this room wouldn't really recognize it as teaching even. It's like a tutoring, except the teachers themselves would struggle to do some of the problems that their students are trying to be able to do.
You should read the preface to the book. We actually have a guy who's probably gotten him fired. Norman Frankenberger talking about, it sounds like he's describing exactly the program you're
Well,
describing.
here's what I'm worried about. Is like it's a system where there is, and my work has been, and some folks that I know who managed to find careers in this field do believe we can build educated students who have dropped and are going to continue to drop out of the K-12 system in large numbers, right?
Right.
So we want to provide rich learning environments for them where they're learning academics and these non-cognitive skills, and I believe it can be taught, but it needs to be in programs that where we can actually invest in teachers to be able to do it. And the system right now doesn't do that. It's we offer them this kind of these ridiculous programs that are incoherent. And so it's not at all surprising to me that either group doesn't do very well later on. The group that didn't take advantage of any preparation after dropping out, or the ones that went to a quickie preparation program where they drilled them on a couple of multiple choice, kinds of practice exercises so they can game the test.
Right.
But they limped to that finish line. They didn't get there by by doing the kinds of things that we know we want students to be able to do. So I'm worried that your work gets interpreted when the headlines come out on the articles. Sometimes when we read the articles, I feel like the politicians say like, oh, see the GED students, they don't do adults who are working towards a GED.
No,
that's my fear.
I would add.
I'm wondering how you think about that.
I would add a point to your. Part of the problem with the GED is that it categorizes all of these students. Some are actually taking intense preparation. We have some evidence. I mean, what is the mean number of hours that we see, like in the mid-90s, like 50, 100?
It's like those that report study 40 hours.
40 hours
or less.
40 hours. But there's a tail to that distribution. And there are schools, like adult high schools, where people are actually learning basic skills. And the trouble is they're getting issued the same credential. So there's a huge signaling issue here. There's kind of diluted, whatever they did. So part of it, I think, is absolutely right, getting high quality. One of the participants in the book, Lois Quinn, has been very emphatic in insisting that we think of adult high schools like originally were in many ways displaced by the GED programs. So again, it's part of the.
But that takes more resources than what
it takes more resources, right? So it's
but
it's a quick fix. I mean, the quick fix is kind of one of the sub themes of the book. That what you're finding is, we have this dropout problem, so we fix it by giving the GED, and miraculously we get rid of all these dropouts. And, it's a miracle, and we get rid of all. We help close the race gap, and again, it's just it's delusion.
It's nonsense.
But I completely agree that we can do better, and we actually have examples in Chapter 9 of the book of much richer programs where there do seem to be substantial lifetime benefits. But they're generally more expensive than $900 a year. I mean, these are very intensive, much more intensive programs. I guess the only thing I would say is that the later we wait, frequently, especially on these measures of teaching people cognition and certain, then generally the more difficult it can get. Now, if you get a kid who's 18 or 19 who has a really rotten attitude, right, it's going to be very difficult to try to motivate that kid. And what we do.
It's tough to broad brush like that because it's absolutely doable. So it is, but not maybe with all students, but
not with all students, and not with the GED program per se. But we actually talk about programs like mentoring, where you actually can then work with a student. This gets back to the point about the one-on-one. So the mentoring programs we have examples in the book of mentoring programs, but that's much more intensive, like you're suggesting. So there's nothing cheap. So a quick fix is not going to be there. So I would agree that the thrust of your comment. But then the question becomes...
That's how you sometimes get interpreted, just so you know.
Oh, no, but that's why we wrote Chapter 9. Is we didn't want to suggest a fatalism.
It never gets in the article, though. When you read it in the paper, it's like, that the quotation is always that the GED graduates perform so much worse in every way than high school graduates. And that's where the quote ends.
Yeah, but see, the trouble is that leads to the idea, well, these are certain types of people who are just fated for death's door. And I think that's exactly what we try to avoid throughout the book and so on. But I do think that that right now American public policy is ignoring it pretty dramatically, right? So I would say the first order line might be to take this approach, but I completely agree that you'd want to qualify it, and we do qualify it by talking about a range of interventions that might be much more productive. Yes?
First, a little background to support what you've outlined. The SAT came out of World War I.
Yes.
And was the beta test to find quality people who would be officers in the Army.
Right.
And the first SAT was given in 1926. So it's an older piece of work.
And much more oriented towards the IQ test.
It is. It's great.
But with also a whole theory of genetics behind it too, right?
That's
I mean, there are people who are gifted and people who aren't, and that's the way they are.
But I just wanted to ask, first, I thought linguist linguist was at the University of Iowa.
He was. But he worked with Tyler.
The ACT. I didn't know he worked with Ralph Tyler.
Oh, I know.
That's terrific.
They collaborated. Tyler was at Ohio State when he started it, but he was educated here in Chicago and then came back and was.
Well, everyone in Illinois takes the ACT, so I'm speaking for the SAT. But my question is, what the possible impact will be on this world of achievement testing, of the new Common Core state standards, then are evolving, are coming out of K-12 education. Is there a new future for achievement tests given Common Core standards?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if to the extent that I still think the achievement test plays an important role. It has some small, it's not the whole story, but it is predictive. It's predictive of some component of knowledge acquired.
Right.
It's just not the whole story. So I think when we look at the Common Core and try to evaluate it, a meaningful metric would be to think about. But the trouble is if the Common Core gets perverted into sort of focusing only on a very narrow set of topics,
And it may.
like No Child Left Behind
Right.
did, then what you're going to get probably is, if anything, a dampening, a diminution of emphasis, even on things like physics and physical education and many other aspects, and never mind these non-cognitive socio-emotional skills, so then schools become a factory trying to get to the students so they can be certified in the Common Core exam, right, at the level.
That's interesting.
Yeah, no, I think that's the distortion that we're kind of getting at. It seems like once you get a tool, then it starts being misused, right, in some sense, because if you can process students cheaply and come up with sharp statements, then that's a great thing to say about, a great thing for a bureaucrat to say. We've really evaluated the schools, we know about it. So,
Good for you.
go ahead, please.
I want to address your comment real quickly because I think there's two important points. First of all, I mean, exactly like you said, there's some students who lack some sort of learning and they need to go learn, and they learn and they take their GED and it demonstrates some sort of academic achievement, and potentially if they had better instruction they would learn more. But our research suggests a fair number of people, and probably the people who aren't showing up for these courses at all, are people who are actually pretty smart. I mean, they're smarter than high school dropouts who don't certify when they're 6, and they're smarter than when high school dropout, or they're about as smart as high school graduates who don't go into college when they drop out. And these students, something else is wrong. I mean, maybe they're involved in drugs, maybe they have a bad home environment, something's going on. Yeah, they had a baby and they dropped out. And I think one of the messages of the book is that we're also offering these students who clearly don't need any sort of a cognitive intervention, but need something else, they're also getting the GED, which is clearly like, and only the GED, because that's
But if
what's
they
offered.
stayed in high school, they would have gotten more teaching too. They
Yeah.
would have
Yes.
gotten other, right, non-cognitive
Yeah.
things by being around other students and going to classes.
And we document that in the book, that
we
there's a
don't
real
stop
value.
teaching them just because they, you know what I mean? Like just because they can already.
Oh yeah,
Maybe,
yeah.
So even if you say cognitively they're okay, we can still teach them.
But we can't, and that's something we actually point out in the book. We actually document in studies that we've done how an extra year of school raises both cognitive and these non-cognitive skills, and which itself helps you in success in life. There aren't that many studies of that topic, but the ones that have been available suggest that there are strong effects. Just as Horace Mann was saying, I mean, I think a good education would actually focus on both dimensions, on multiple dimensions of what we mean by.
Maybe I cut you off, but maybe I was trying to say that they would still come to a
Yeah,
robust
so, I mean,
preparation
I
program where they get academic.
Yeah, I think
Right.
we would agree with that and say in some ways the GED is shortcutting, and even a lot of the people who select into the GED are exactly the people you would think
Need most.
would not benefit from some sort of test prep or some sort of algebra review.
Oh, they-
I mean, so
they need
some,
real-
but a large number of them potentially not. And the other thing in the book is we document kind of the history of how the GED displaced other programs, because you have competition for government funding, and the government sort of does some sort of accountability measures, such as how many high school graduates or equivalents do you produce. And you have this kind of crowding out where if you administer the GED, you produce a lot of high school equivalents. So it's much easier for you to like certify that you're doing things as a nonprofit organization than nonprofit organizations trying to do more. Right? So you also have, we talk about this in the book.
Well, that's also related to activity in adolescent interventions. The Job Corps is kind of a favorite in American society. We've had these evaluations of the Job Corps in the last decade or so showing that it has very little effect. If anything, it's a negative return. I mean, once you get the kid out of the environment, so it's a very controlled environment when you're in Job Corps for most facilities. Once you get the kid out of the environment, there's not much difference in terms of earnings and social behavior. But how was the Job Corps justified for many decades? The GED. It was a GED factory. That was the way they measured success. So they would report, we produced many high school graduates. And if you look closely at the statistics, virtually all of those, right? I mean, I don't think there are very many true high
Their
school
teaching
graduates.
is just as dreary and the other.
I think they're high school equivalents. And my guess is if you ask the majority of people in Congress, Democrat and Republican, about whether or not the GED is a high school degree, equivalent to a high school degree, they would say yes. And they would be happy with the evaluations they're getting on Job Corps and many other things. So I think it's an educational. I think you're right, though. We need to think more deeply about how producing these skills, and if we want to produce them, to take serious efforts.
I thought it was going to be a great new source of income. It was more complex.
We would have. You would have had all the job training programs.
Right. You have a hand over there.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Hi, thanks so much. 2 questions. One is the GED actually, have there been studies about whether it's a signal, a negative signal actually on resumes? And the other question I had was, what else besides delayed gratification has been shown to be sort of a predictor of the non-cognitive skill category? And have you looked at how to build those things? What
the non-cognitive skills. Yeah.
Yeah. What programs build those different skills?
We look at the signaling because we have panel data. We can actually look at the effect of what the wage gaps would be. Now, it's a delicate area where you actually say, okay, a lot of the kids taking the GED don't have wage histories before they had the GED, but there are plenty of people who take the GEDs in the 20s and so forth. So granted that, we have a select group of people, what you can do is you can look at their wages before the GED and their wages after and see if there's any gain. Does the GED have a positive or negative signal? Well, my guess is if anything, it has a slightly negative signal, but it certainly doesn't have a positive signal. And many people have argued that it could be a signal of ability, right? And so we argue, of course, that it could be a signal of having deficient non-cognitive skills. But we haven't found such evidence of strongly negative.
No, not
Slightly negative, but it's not like an overwhelming signal, as you might expect. And that was a little disappointing, because actually we would have expected that. Now, in terms of shaping these skills, that's what Chapter 9 of the book is about. And I think it's pretty much up to date as we speak now, because many people are asking, right, for just copies of that chapter by itself. And we go through a range of interventions, starting from the earliest, when kids are, 6 months, 8 months old, to adolescent interventions when people are in their 20s. Post-adolescent interventions, people are in their 20s, and we think about intensive mentoring programs. And that's why I was saying that, so we do see successful programs, and there are programs that can teach these life skills, and they do have long-term follow-up. And virtually all of the studies that we talk about are studies that have been evaluated by randomized trials or high-quality non-randomized studies, but with long-term follow-up. That's one of the dangers in this area, is getting short-term experiments and following only for 6 to 8 months. Here we want to really follow into, and so we do have a list of them. I don't know if you want to go through a list of all the programs, Tim?
Gotta buy the book.
Gotta buy the book. No, but there's that, yeah. No, we actually do, and the book has a huge appendix online where we go into greater detail on each of these programs. And it's an ongoing area. I mean, I would have put in this Montreal program had I known about it. And so I keep learning. We're a center of this activity. We're not the only activity here in the world. And so we keep learning, and there's wider activity. I will say, Tim and I went to a conference last March in Sao Paulo, and everybody knows the PISA score, right? PISA is the big test. OECD has been promoting the PISA scores, for 20 years or so? It's a big activity, right? Trying to evaluate the success of whole educational systems by their PISA scores. I was in India recently, and we found out that India had dropped its use of the PISA test. And it wasn't because they found anything wrong with the PISA test. The scores were so low, it was embarrassing, so they could drop. But OECD convened this conference on social and emotional skills, non-cognitive skills, character skills, because they wanted to develop inventories in making national comparisons and comparisons at the school level to make this, to come up with a richer, deeper understanding of the possibilities for people. And so I think that's a very healthy sign that we're going to think about education more broadly. I think we had this period where we focused on education in a very narrow academic, you still see it. You still see it. I mean, here at Chicago, University of Chicago especially, we think, everything is smarts and it's all, but we also know that most everybody who's here has been pretty persistent. They're staying with it, but that's kind of taken as a given. But when evaluating whole educational systems, we really want to bring in these other dimensions. But we do talk about that, and it's mentoring, and there are programs that are being tried, and there's not a universal success. So what's the name of this program that was tried out in Tennessee? It's an early childhood program teaching soft skills, executive functioning. Oh, you know what I mean. There was an intervention done that showed sort of negative effects.
I don't know about the Tennessee one.
You don't remember?
But there are other examples where programs haven't succeeded. I mean,
they haven't succeeded, and there's some hope that, you know, some short-term interventions might do. Do you know the name of it? What is it? It's in the book, actually. I don't even.
We're going to read the book.
They read the book. I mean, we have a lot of interventions, but the fact of the matter is that some of these interventions haven't been all that successful, especially the short-term interventions. Now, just last Sunday in the New York Times, I don't know if people read the Paul Tough article. That seemed too good to be true, to be honest. I'm getting a lot of emails saying, do you believe that? We were together with Tough in Sao Paulo at this conference. And there are...
Paul was there?
Paul was at Sao Paulo, right. But selling his book more than participating. That's fine. I'm glad the book...
What else?
Yeah. No, but I think the structure of there's some hope that we can do very cheap fixes. I see this as the GED problem again. That suddenly we have this little trick or this little gimmick, and with 2 or 3 hours in your child's life, we change their... I hope that's true. And I don't want to stop the quest for it. It's like, you know, the quest for gold in Kansas or something. I think it should continue. But to me, it's when we looked at a lot of these interventions that have been, they were short-term interventions, and typically there was fade-out, where you had these very short-term, kind of feel-good interventions about... But there do seem to be interventions that are effective. Like we know that when people apply to college, if you give children, especially from disadvantaged environments, much more help in how to fill out the forms and explaining the whole system of how you succeed in these application forms and the like, that can have lasting consequences. There are studies of that, right? So we know that giving people information can sometimes be very helpful, and it's not all that costly. So I'm not going to rule out, but when you're teaching basic skills, I think it's kind of wishful thinking, right? That a few hours, or even a few weeks.
To think that you can get rich quick. Everyone hopes that, but
yeah.
Of course you can.
Yes.
I'm looking at your subtitle, Role of Character in American Life, and I'm curious, when we define character, is there a universally accepted definition? I mean, is the role of character different, say, in Chinese life or in Brazilian life? Or?
Well, that's interesting. We have some studies on that, and there are studies that are underway on that. So the personality psychologists talk about the big five. They have these traits. I'm not wedded to the big five, but there are these so-called big five traits. They have this acronym, OCEAN, for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And then they have facets of each of these. Neuroticism. No, you want your heart surgeon to be a neurotic person, you know, very, very compulsive.
Not me.
No, I think you do. You want them just to be very, you don't want them to leave a sponge in your chest or something, right? So, I don't know. That's partly related to compulsive. But in China, there have been studies that suggest something like the Big Seven, right? And that certain traits, so there is a cultural dependence. And this is an argument we have, it's ongoing discussion with personality psychologists to see whether or not there's a So Confucian ethic would actually suggest certain values that are probably less prevalent in the Western Big Five. And that's exactly the kind of... What's that?
What are the additional? You said 7.
Well, part of it was actually filial piety, and some of it, you know, just being relationship with... Where many Western modes would say this is very good, the child is becoming independent. So autonomy is something that is captured and viewed as a positive notion. But group participation and more collective effort is much more emphasized, I think, in some of the Confucian cultures and East Asian culture. And whereas we think autonomy, I mean here in the United States, and we think about devising these Big Five tests, we're thinking more about these other aspects. So I think there has to be a cultural adaptation. And right now, actually, in China, that's going on, where people are studying these. But I'm not even sure the Big Five is the right inventory. I'm pretty sure it's not, actually. I mean, it was arrived at by factor analysis. People were putting these, and, you know, so it's very convenient. But we were with the Oliver John, who's at Berkeley, who helped develop with, what's his name, what's his name? there's another guy at University of Oregon who was his teacher. The two of them developed, I can't remember his teacher's name, but Oliver John was there, and he admitted that there were probably better measures, right? And that we want to think about behaviors. Instead of looking at some test score, we might want to think about behaviors. So teacher ratings, inventory ratings. The grade contains some of that already, how well the child performed. But it's an open area. So character, though, the trouble is the word character. We had people who cautioned us against even using that word because it sounded very prudish and Victorian, you know, you must be doing this, you cannot do this. But we defend it in the following way, that it really is this kind of notion of your ability to kind of operate and in your culture and in your context and operate effectively. So it's not necessarily autonomy. It's not necessarily the Marlboro man riding off into the horizon, especially in East Asian societies. But it would be kind of cooperating and participating in that larger society instead of antisocial notion. But no, I don't think there is inventory. Question?
Can we wrap it up?
You want to wrap it up?
Yeah.
You're getting sick of this.
No, I'm not getting sick.
Okay. We're taking up store space here. Yes, go ahead, please. I'll go in order here, okay?
So what do you think are some of the policy lessons that countries like China, where the educational system is largely test-based, well, not exactly achievement test-based, but
yes,
still largely test-based from this book or your research in general?
Well, see, this is a very interesting question. I was speaking on the importance of character in Korea. This is right at the Asian...
South or north?
No, not north. Well, Tim went with Dennis Rodman to North Korea to lecture on it, but I wasn't part of that group. No, in South Korea. And in some sense, I felt the talk was a disaster because I was emphasizing soft skills. The South Koreans are very hard-working as a group. Even though they don't rate themselves as being particularly conscientious, they are typically very conscientious. So in some sense, I was bringing the coals to Newcastle and saying you should do it. But I think what's happened is in China and in Japan and also in Taiwan and in many countries in East Asia, there's been a growing perception, at least an interest on the part of the educational I would call it bureaucracy, but educators in the society, of thinking about more comprehensive measures. But it's just that that people don't think that Asian societies have the typical problem with non-cognitive skills. I'm sure there are non-cognitive skills, but part of the whole training built into the culture has been perseverance, tenacity, and so forth. In fact, you know, Confucian ethic, exactly. There's a famous book that was written by a psychologist. Actually, he's a political scientist. He turned psychologist, named Flynn. He's famous for the Flynn effect about the growth of IQ. But earlier, he asked a question. So I know IQ is increasing over all generations, each generation at rates that are incredibly high, almost unbelievable. That's another whole story. Flynn looked at the book of the success of Asian Americans. He said, why are Asian Americans doing better in schools and in life, at least the dimensions he had, it was mostly academic measures that he had, than, say, Europeans. And everybody was initially saying, oh, the East Asian IQ is 10 points higher, East Asians are intrinsically smarter. That was the idea. What Flynn came along with was the notion, no. What was actually was the personality traits and the ability. So the amount of homework done, the amount of time spent, work harder, exactly. But it was part of the cultural tradition of many of the East Asian societies. So when people talk about success of different cultures and failure, part of it, they look to the East Asian societies, but not necessarily for higher innate IQ at birth, but for actually teaching. So now in extreme cases, the tiger mom, the whole discussion, right, saying, oh, maybe a tiger mom will make you into, their kid's neurotic, and so that's bad, although in the Big Five, that's good, I guess. So anyway, that hits the note, Big Five maybe should be junked. But so I do think that we have a policy lesson that comes out. I think in China there's real interest. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add that actually when we were in Sao Paulo, we met with one of the ministers of education from South Korea, and they're actually very recently, probably before your talk, or after your talk, started implementing measures of like character skills that teachers fill out for each student. and they would actually collect these and follow the students using these. So they're just starting right now. So they're actually in some sense ahead of the U.S. in terms of evaluating these things.
So there haven't been that many studies yet done on Chinese populations. In Taiwan, yes, there are population type, but not in the mainland Chinese, to my knowledge. But they are being done now as part of other studies of educational attainment. So let me get to him, and then I'll get to you. Oh, there are three. Sorry. I will. Can I go around in a circle here? Okay, go ahead. Yes.
Okay, thank you. We meet each other in Beijing last
Yes.
year. Yeah. I would like to know, in your program, in your research design, how to avoid the sample selection bias. You just mentioned your design is not random-sized
Oh,
research.
well, actually, we don't really have many studies. We have sort of indirect studies where we're not randomly assigning GEDs and so forth. So what we're doing instead is trying a lot of robust strategies to try to make sure the results that emerge are robust to alternative treatments. We have very rich measures of both cognitive and non-cognitive measures, family background and the like. And we do a sensitivity analysis, which you can read in the book, where we actually fit more than 100,000 different specifications, and then ask across those specifications, what were the effects that came out from the GEDs? How often were the GEDs statistically significantly better than the high school, or as good as the high school graduates, okay? Or were they better than dropouts? That was really the test. And we find across those robust many specifications, virtually all specifications, right, that we don't find. So there's always going to be a question. You might have tried something better, but isn't it we just fit one model and we do it one way? We try lots of different ways. But it's basically a strategy of controlling for observables. We tried some studies controlling for unobservables, but they really didn't have much of an effect in this particular instance, using econometric methods for selection bias. So we
How
actually...
many people take the GED?
Oh, quite a number take the GED. Each year?
Yes.
600,000 to
well, far less than
900,000.
the ACT or...
Oh, yes. Oh, and there are other studies, though. There actually was a study that was done, a so-called, like a regression discontinuity design study, that was taken where you did find people who were just above and below the threshold. This was in Missouri, a study that was done, right, by Musser and Trotsky and who else? Jepson. And there what we find is that people just above and just below are earning essentially the same wages. So it's really not any real effect of the GED per se. They're not finding any effects of this. So a variety of strategies, which we all summarize in the book, are showing that these effects are robust. But it's a perfectly legitimate question. There are many people who would say, unless you have a randomized controlled trial, you don't really know anything. I'm not in that camp, but I think you probably have to work harder. And these guys will testify that we worked harder, and we worked hard anyway. We have enough. So you have to convince yourself. But we put these data online. Everything can be replicated, and it's multiple data sets too. So it's not, and it's longitudinal data. So you have the benefit of being able to follow people, in some cases from very early on in life, right, into their adult lives. And so you're able to actually use a lot of standard methods. So we have both longitudinal methods, cross-section methods, and they agree on the findings, right? So, yes.
So I was wondering, so you talk a lot about achievement tests and how they're imperfect measures of really what the effects of teaching are as a whole.
Yes.
One of the things that makes achievement tests and other standardized tests so attractive is that a decision maker can look to them as evidence of how schools are doing relative to one another in terms of how well they're educating their students.
Yes.
But of course that omits those non-cognitive skills that students may be learning, and also it doesn't control for variance and demographics across the different schools.
Correct.
Do you make any recommendations or speak to a different measure of how education could be effective, or how it can be assessed by decision makers who have to assess how schools are doing relative to one another?
No, definitely. So one thing is to say, oh, it's there, theoretically it matters. Intuitively, these things matter. Time preference, discounting, how well you can control yourself. But on the other hand, the practical mechanism haven't been put in place until recently, but we summarize what they are. Tim's use of the administrative data from schools So you can look at the, records of people getting into special education, getting various kinds of teacher ratings and assessments. And Kirbo Jackson, who's at Northwestern University, has been using a similar strategy, right? So you can look at administrative data. So it's not just a pipe dream. You can actually use what available records are. And in fact, in some of the work that we did in Perry, we found when we were looking at the effect of these non-cognitive skills and explaining so much of the early treatment effect of these early childhood programs, that we had teacher ratings in the first and second and third grades. And again, you could average out so you weren't, the student wasn't the victim. We weren't the victims either of just one teacher who didn't like one student. So you could get some averaging and get rid of outliers and so forth. So there are effective ways to measure it. But I think that's an ongoing area because the psychologists like to think of tests as measures that are objective and clean. As economists, we tend to think, well, we like to look at how people actually behave. And the behaviors and the measures really are the same, part of the same story. And both measures, the behaviors and the tests, have to correct for the fact that there are incentives in those tests and incentives in situations to take the test. So if I give you a job interview to see how agreeable you are, so I say, okay, John Eric, are you agreeable? I'm about to decide whether to hire you. He is not going to tell me, no, I'm a very disagreeable person. And so the whole bias is really there. But you can by looking at behaviors and long-term. And so, there's a study. There's a lot of study. For example, mothers are typically less reliable about evaluating their children, partly because they don't have a very big base. Teachers are much more reliable, actually, because they have many years of experience. Mothers don't have many kids like teachers have many kids. And so you have a reference group, and that reference group helps them give much, and so they're actually much more predictive, those measures. So we go through those, but we also go back to some of the same measures that Tyler suggested in his writings on the National Assessment for Educational Progress, which were exactly using these teacher inventories. Today's NAEP. So when NAEP was first put in, Tyler was actually suggesting we have these non-cognitive traits. He was always complaining. It's just that the technology, it's a good economic argument. The relative cost of giving an achievement test is quite low. Assessing this other way is somewhat more complicated. But we're making it cheaper now because we have these administrative records, right?
Yeah, I would just add one thing to that. In the research that I'm doing, and also from the consortium of school research here, we're looking at these other possible measures that schools already have. So one option would be to have teachers rate all students. Another option is to use what we already have. And things like attendance are really, really predictive. They're not that correlated with test scores, and they actually outperform the 9th grade test score in terms of who finishes high school. It really surprised me. I thought it would be good, but it's about twice as predictive as the test scores.
That's the subject that's in evolution. So this book is becoming, I shouldn't say it's obsolete, but we talk about the latest lines. But the point of all research is that you're finding more work. And my guess is in a few more years we're going to have even better inventories on this. Patty's saying I should stop. Wait, but yeah, I know. I think you're the last question. You're the last question.
Sure. Yeah, I think this goes back to what we were talking about Asian Americans and how they've been so successful sort of in America. And I wanted to ask you about sort of the difference between objective testing and sort of whether or not you're advocating for soft measures for soft skills.
Soft measures? I'm not sure.
As in, so like, for example, you're talking about how we should move beyond what we have in current achievement tests and look at executive functioning and sort of delayed gratification. But for me, like, especially when you use the word character and sort of talk in those, in that sense, it kind of is reminiscent of sort of holistic testing and what it meant when you had Ivy League sort of discriminating against Jewish Americans in the early 90s and 20s and 30s, and how today a lot of people are saying that Asian Americans are being excluded from sort of higher education elite institutions by going from objective testing to non-objective testing. For example, if you look at magnet schools, especially you look at stuff like Stuyvesant and sort of Thomas Jefferson High, you have an insanely high proportion of Asian Americans in those schools where you only have one exam, say, to get into the school. And when you look at private schools, sort of more feeder schools like Collegiate or Phillips Academy, the numbers are much lower, and consequently in Ivy Leagues they're much lower as well. So I don't know, I'm a little hesitant to see when we move beyond just academic sort of objective testing, where that goes and how that might affect certain demographics of society.
Well, for one thing, it turns out a lot of the non-cognitive measures have actually been pretty neutral. So I mean, you're suggesting two very different things, kind of exclusion on the basis of race, which is definitely practiced. We know in American society, Jews and blacks and many groups have been discriminated against in this way. And you're absolutely right. If you look at pure ability tests, you'd find that you get a very strong concentration of certain groups. But this is slightly different, I think, from the notion of using the high school transcript, right? And using sort of whether you get a B in Texas or so to get into. This is really starting to look at, I'm not suggesting that we screen out, but I think we should say motivation plays a huge role, motivation and drive. So you recognize, so I'm not suggesting that we think about this as a way that's being exclusive, but it's certainly sort of saying, what about the things that are inclusive? Which traits are those that make people more, which we might not look at? So for example, you might find a kid from a disadvantaged background who might not do all that well on an achievement test, partly because they've been to rotten schools, they haven't had very good environments maybe before that time, but they may be highly motivated. And the question then becomes, do we want to deny them? And maybe somebody who's very aspirational, right? Somebody who's really trying hard, you want to give them that opportunity. So I view it in a less negative light, maybe. So you have a very negative notion of character as being kind of race or ethnicity, and that's not the sense that we're talking about. We're talking about really these characteristics which we know are very predictive in terms of success. Now, being smart is important. Everybody knows that. But it's also other things. We also know plenty of smart people who fail miserably in life because they can't put it together. So that's the sense in which I'm suggesting these other traits matter. But I don't think it's exclusionary. In fact, many people, the personality psychologists would argue that actually these non-cognitive traits are less discriminatory, although there's a whole technical issue that if you start looking at racial differences and so forth, that they tend to be much less racial differences, among groups and ethnic differences than there would be, for example, so maybe we focused too much on Asian Americans a minute ago, but if you start looking at it, that they tend to be less biased. That's an argument in favor of certain kinds of tests of these non-cognitive traits that the personality psychologists will make. I'm not completely comfortable with that argument because some of the tests they use are self-reports and they're not anchored, so we don't really know if they're objective. You get back into a circle. I don't know if that answers your question. Not really, I guess, right?
I mean, is motivation measured in sort of how is motivation measured? Use the example.
Well, but I mean, you ask a teacher how much did a first, second grade teacher? You sort of look at the inventory. If a kid is just not very motivated, kind of bored by school, not doing homework, if those measures are kind of persistent. I'm not saying they're fully persistent. In fact, the whole hope and the knowledge that we have in the intervention literature is that they are malleable and that they are not these traits. They are skills that can be acquired. But to the extent that at a certain age we find kids who are less engaged, we're going to find that typically less attractive. They're going to probably do less well in school. But I don't deny that there might not be transformations of personality. People have moments of salvation, they have moments of insight. People turn around. George Bush, right? He was a drunk and he became president.
That was good.
I didn't say it was good, but he certainly became more focused. So what I'm saying, we do see that, and I work with a guy, I won't mention his name, who was in Alcoholics Anonymous 15, 20 years ago, and now he's a very successful, investor, and so people can change, and I think we want to always allow that possibility for change. You want to kick us out?
I just need to close the shop. So thank you.
Oh, you're closing. We're
closing in about half an hour.
I see.
To get everybody.
Okay, fine.
All together.
Very good.
Thank you everyone for coming out. Thank you for the University of Chicago Press for helping put this together. And let's all thank Professor Heckman.
And these guys.
And books are on the table and the registers are just over here if anybody wants to buy any.